I've always found train rides peaceful. There's something about the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks that soothes the nerves, like a lullaby for grown-ups. The gentle swaying, the landscape blurring by. It's like the world is moving while you stay still. I'd take the late-night trains back home after my shifts at the hospital, exhausted but content. That night, though, something was different. I boarded the train as usual, settling into my seat by the window. There were only a few passengers, most of them already half asleep, their heads lolling with the motion of the train. The car felt unusually quiet, the kind of silence that stretches thin and taut, like an unspoken warning. The lights flickered briefly as the train started moving, the hum of the engine the only thing breaking the oppressive quiet. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and let the sound of the wheels lull me into a half-doze. That's when I noticed the man sitting a few rows ahead of me. I hadn't paid much attention to him when I boarded, but now his presence gnawed at me. He was motionless, sitting unnervingly still, staring straight ahead without blinking. His clothes were ordinary, a simple coat and slacks, but his rigid posture felt wrong, like he didn't belong there. I tried to shake off the unease and closed my eyes again, telling myself I was just tired. But when I opened them a few minutes later, he had turned around in his seat. He wasn't looking at me directly, just staring in my general direction, like he was listening. His eyes were wide, glassy. He didn't blink. Kenny. I shifted in my seat, uncomfortable now, feeling like I was being watched even when I wasn't. But it wasn't just him. The whole train car felt off. The windows had fogged up slightly, and despite the temperature being normal when I boarded, there was a chill creeping in, making the air feel heavy, oppressive. I rubbed my arms, trying to shake off the cold, but it only seemed to sink deeper into my skin. The other passengers were still there, but they felt like shadows. Their heads were turned away, slumped over in sleep or something like sleep, but their presence felt distant, hollow, like they were barely there. I looked back at the man. He was closer now, 2 rows ahead, but I hadn't heard him move. His back was turned again, and for a moment I wondered if I had imagined him looking at me before. But no. The chill in the air deepened, and I knew. He had moved. Chikamaitsio. The train rattled through the night, passing through stretches of empty darkness, the lights inside flickering again, longer this time. When they came back on, I gasped. He was sitting directly across from me now. I hadn't heard him move. Not a sound. He didn't make eye contact, didn't acknowledge me at all, just stared straight ahead. His hands were resting on his knees, and they were pale. Too pale. Thin, like there wasn't enough skin covering the bones. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. It was just a man, I told myself. Just another passenger. Maybe I was overreacting, letting my exhaustion get the better of me. But there was something about him, his stillness, the unnatural way he sat, like a statue that made the hairs on the back of my neck rise. I turned away, staring out the window. The landscape outside had changed. We were passing through an industrial area now, but the buildings looked abandoned, crumbling. It didn't make sense this route didn't pass through places like this. The familiar fields and towns I usually saw were nowhere to be found. Just decaying warehouses, rusted machinery, and tracks overgrown with weeds. It was as if the train had taken a wrong turn, slipping into a part of the world forgotten by time. The air in the train car grew colder, almost suffocating now. My breath fogged the window, and I wiped it away with my sleeve, only to see something that made my stomach twist. Outside, in the darkness, there were figures. Not standing still, but moving, jerky, unnatural movements. They were too far to make out clearly, but they were there, just at the edge of the dim light spilling from the train. They moved along the tracks, keeping pace with the train, their limbs bending at odd angles, like they weren't quite human. I pulled away from the window, my pulse pounding in my ears. Something was wrong. I needed to get off the train. I stood up, ready to move to the next car, but as soon as I did, the man across from me finally looked at me. His face was blank, expressionless, but his eyes were filled with something I couldn't describe. Something hungry. His lips parted slightly, but he didn't speak. His gaze pinned me to the spot, and I couldn't move. I was frozen, trapped by the weight of his stare. The other passengers remained motionless, unaware, or maybe just uncaring. The train slowed. Not stopping, but slowing enough that I could hear the rhythmic thud of something hitting the wheels. Like there was something on the tracks, something the train was running over again and again. The sound echoed in the stillness, and with every bump, the man across from me leaned a little closer, his eyes never leaving mine. I forced myself to move, breaking free from whatever invisible force held me in place. I stumbled into the aisle, my legs weak beneath me, and hurried toward the next car. But when I reached the door, it wouldn't open. I pulled at it, panic rising in my throat, but it was locked, sealed. Behind me, the man stood up, slowly, deliberately. He didn't make a sound, but I could feel him approaching. I banged on the door, shouting, but the other passengers didn't move, didn't even flinch. They were like mannequins, frozen in place. The train lurched, throwing me against the door, and I heard a low, grinding sound beneath us, like metal on metal. The lights flickered again, and this time, when they came back on, the entire car was empty. Everyone was gone. Gone, except for him. I turned, pressing my back against the door. He was standing just a few feet away now, his head tilted slightly, as if curious. His hands hung limply at his sides, and his face was still blank, but his eyes, they burned with something terrible, something not human. The darkness swallowed me, but I kept moving. My heart pounded in my chest as I bolted down the aisle, desperate to reach the door at the end of the train car. Behind me, I could feel him, his cold, relentless presence, creeping closer with every second. I threw myself at the door, yanking the handle with all my strength. It opened with a screech, and I stumbled into the night, the cold air hitting me like a wall. Without thinking, I jumped off the train, tumbling down a steep embankment and crashing into the brush below. Bruised and breathless, I scrambled to my feet. The train, a hulking shadow in the distance, sped away into the night, the screech of its wheels fading into the darkness. For a moment I stood there, shaking, unsure if it was real, but the sound of the wind and the rustling of leaves grounded me. I was alive. I had escaped. The train was gone, but the cold chill in the air lingered, as if it had left something behind watching, waiting. And I knew I would never take that train again. The rhythmic clatter of the train wheels had always soothed me, a familiar lullaby as I made my way home every weekend. I settled into my usual seat by the window, watching the landscape blur past, an endless stream of trees and fields. This routine was a welcome escape from the chaos of city life, and each return felt like a small victory, a reminder that tranquility existed somewhere beyond the urban sprawl. As the train journeyed deeper into the countryside, a sudden jolt ran through the carriage, snapping me from my reverie. The lights flickered ominously, and a hush fell over the passengers. Moments later, the conductor's voice crackled over the intercom, strained and filled with urgency. "We've encountered a problem. Please remain calm." The train lurched violently, metal groaning in protest, and came to a screeching halt. My stomach dropped as I realized we had derailed. I glanced around at the frightened faces of my fellow passengers, their expressions a mix of confusion and fear. The conductor hurriedly directed us to exit the train, urging everyone to move quickly, and I felt a wave of panic wash over me. Grabbing my backpack, I joined the throng of passengers spilling onto the cold ground. The train lay twisted on the tracks, a metal behemoth in disarray, smoke curling into the twilight sky. Some passengers lingered, clutching their belongings and staring in shock at the wreckage. I knew I needed to get home. The train station was miles away, and my house was even farther. My heart raced as I made the decision to brave the dark forest that bordered the tracks. The path was barely visible, overgrown with brambles and shadows. As I stepped away from the wreckage, a chill swept through the trees, whispering secrets in a language I couldn't understand. I hurried forward, each crunch of twigs beneath my feet amplifying the silence around me. After what felt like hours of trudging through the dense underbrush, I began to sense I was not alone. The air thickened with an oppressive dread, and the shadows grew longer, shifting ominously in my peripheral vision. I quickened my pace, each heartbeat echoing in my ears. That's when I heard a low growl emanating from the depths of the forest, sending a shiver down my spine. My instincts screamed at me to run. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel the presence lurking just out of sight. Before I could take another step, I caught a glimpse of something grotesque among the trees. It was a creature unlike anything I had ever seen, tall and emaciated, with skin that resembled decaying bark, and hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through me like daggers. Its jaw unhinged, revealing rows of jagged teeth as it let out a bone-chilling wail that echoed through the night, reverberating through my very bones. I turned and ran, adrenaline surging through my veins, my instincts kicking in as I fled deeper into the woods. Branches whipped against my skin, tearing at my clothes as I stumbled through the underbrush. The creature followed, its growls growing louder, closer. Each thud of its footfalls sent a wave of dread crashing over me, and I could feel its breath, cold and foul, on my neck. I burst into a clearing, moonlight illuminating the path ahead. My house was still miles away, but I couldn't stop. I kept running, pushing through the pain, fueled by sheer terror. The forest felt alive, shadows moving and shifting as if mocking my plight. I could hear the rustle of leaves, the snapping of twigs behind me. Finally, I broke through the tree line and onto the dirt road leading home. I sprinted, my legs screaming in protest, but I couldn't look back. Not now. The creature was gaining on me, its guttural growls echoing through the night, mixing with the sounds of my frantic breaths. When I reached my driveway, I lunged for the front door, fumbling with the lock as panic surged within me. It swung open, and I stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind me. I leaned against the door, chest heaving, listening intently for any sign of my pursuer. The house was silent, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. After a few moments, I gathered my courage and peeked through the window. The moon hung high, casting a silvery glow over the yard, but there was no sign of the creature. The forest stood still, eerily quiet. I thought I was safe. I had escaped. But as I turned away from the window, I noticed deep scratches along the doorframe, long, claw-like marks, freshly made. My blood ran cold as the realization sank in. Whatever had chased me through the woods wasn't done. It was still out there, watching, waiting for its next opportunity. I moved cautiously through the house, locking each door and window, my heart racing with every creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. I tried to convince myself it was just a nightmare, that I'd wake up in the morning, but the fear gripped me tighter. I grabbed my phone and tried to call for help, but there was no signal. The isolation of my home felt suffocating. I could hear the wind howling outside, carrying with it the rustling of leaves, but now it sounded different, threatening. I turned off all the lights and drew the curtains, plunging the house into darkness, hoping that somehow, if I couldn't see it, it wouldn't see me. Hours passed, each minute stretching into an eternity. I sat on the floor, my back pressed against the wall, straining to hear any sign of movement outside. As I sat there, shadows danced in the corners of my vision, and every little noise made me jump. It was impossible to tell if the sounds were real or just my imagination playing tricks on me. Just as I thought I might finally be alone, I heard a loud bang at the front door. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. The creature had found me. I held my breath, adrenaline surging as I waited for the next sound. A low growl rumbled outside, deep and rumbling, and I pressed my palms to my ears, trying to block it out. I barely slept that night, every creak of the house and rustle of the wind outside turning my nerves raw. I kept hearing whispers, faint, unintelligible, as if the forest itself was calling out to me, reminding me that it hadn't let me go. My mind spun with images of the creature. Its hollow eyes and twisted form burned into my memory. Though the days passed and I tried to regain some sense of normalcy, one thing was certain: I never took the train again. That journey, that night, it had changed me. And somewhere deep down, I knew it wasn't over. I was sitting at home, flipping through channels when my phone rang. It was Dan, an old friend I hadn't seen in ages. We used to hang out all the time before life got in the way: work, responsibilities, everything pulling us in different directions. He sounded excited, like he had something planned. "Hey man," he said, "how about a weekend at the cabin? It's been too long and I could really use the company." The cabin. I hadn't thought about it in years. Nestled in the woods about 3 towns over, it was our old getaway spot, perfect for fishing and unwinding. I agreed without hesitation. It would be great to catch up, and the change of pace was exactly what I needed. We worked out the details, and I booked a train ticket for later that evening. As I arrived at the station, the place felt unusually quiet, especially for a Friday night. A cold breeze swept through, making the empty platforms feel even more desolate. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me as I waited for the train. It arrived with a slow screech, its lights casting a dim glow in the foggy night. The metal doors opened with a hiss, and I stepped inside, expecting the usual bustling crowd of weekend travelers. But when I looked around, the carriage was completely empty. Not a single person. At first, I thought I had boarded the wrong train, but a quick glance at the screen confirmed I was in the right place. Still, something about the emptiness felt off. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just a quiet night or maybe I was early. I found a seat by the window and settled in, pulling out my phone to pass the time. As the train started moving, a strange heaviness settled over me. It wasn't just the silence, it was something in the air, a tension that made me uneasy. The lights overhead flickered faintly, casting long, jittery shadows across the empty seats. I tried to shake the feeling, focusing on the landscape rushing past outside. Dark trees blurred by under the faint glow of the moon, their twisted branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. It should have been peaceful, but instead, I felt like I was being watched. A movement at the far end of the carriage caught my eye. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but as I squinted, I saw a shadowy figure standing in the aisle. My heart skipped a beat. It was just standing there, not moving, not making a sound. I blinked, trying to make sense of it. The lights flickered again, and for a second, the figure seemed to shift, inching closer. My pulse quickened. I stood up, looking around for any sign of another passenger or a conductor, but the carriage was still empty, except for the figure. I glanced back and it was closer now. The shape was tall and unnaturally thin, its outline distorted as if it didn't belong in this world. My chest tightened as I realized there was no face, just a blank, shadowy void where its features should have been. Every instinct in my body screamed to get out. I grabbed my bag and bolted down the aisle, my footsteps echoing in the empty carriage. As I ran, I could feel the figure behind me, moving faster than I could comprehend. The air grew colder, and a strange pressure filled the space, like the walls themselves were closing in. I reached the nearest door, fumbling with the emergency release. My hands shook, heart pounding as I finally yanked it open and leapt onto the platform. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop running. I tore through the empty station, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I reached the street. Only when I was far from the train did I dare to glance back. The platform was still. The train sat motionless, its windows dark, and there was no sign of the figure. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined it, if maybe the isolation and silence had gotten to me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Whatever I had seen, it was real, and it wasn't human. I thought about calling Dan, explaining why I wasn't going to make it to the cabin, but my hands were trembling too much to hold the phone. Instead, I kept walking, putting as much distance between myself and the train as possible. The streets were quiet, the few people I passed oblivious to what I had just experienced. I decided to walk the rest of the way home. The night felt colder than before, every shadow seeming to stretch toward me. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I had seen. What was that thing? Why had it appeared on an empty train in the middle of the night? Was it following me? My thoughts spiraled as I walked through unfamiliar streets, the route back home feeling longer than usual. Every sound a distant car engine, the rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the shadowy figure again, standing at the edge of the street, watching. When I finally reached my apartment, I slammed the door shut, locking it and checking it twice. My heart was still racing, my skin prickling with the sensation of being watched.